Welcome, everyone, to this month's exclusive. We are super excited today to be talking about accessibility and specifically Build Capable XCL accessibility with Jacob Wood, who is a frequent attendee of the exclusives, which we love. And we are thrilled to have him as a guest this week. Without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Sarah and Jacob to get us started.
Yeah, so Jacob, I have been following your work for a long time, but not everybody knows you like I do at this point. So, could you
Yeah,
tell us a little bit about yourself?
for sure. And likewise, I've been following you for a long time, it feels so. It's good. I'm Jacob Wood. I'm the owner of Growth for All. It's a Substack where I really talk about accessibility, learning, leadership, and the intersection of those three things. I'm also a screen reader tester. I'm a native NVDA user, meaning I am legally blind and I use NVDA in everyday life for everything that I do in relation to a computer. And one of the things that brought me to this work in particular was that I was a learning designer for about 3 years up until recently. And so I have a lot of crossover between learning design, technology, and accessibility. And I've seen a lot of the good and a whole lot of the bad. And I'm on my own mission to help change the world to make it a little bit better as best I can. And Sarah, what you've been doing, and all of you with Build Capable, is really what made me start following XCL to begin with. Is that I noticed that you were so committed to accessibility and, in particular, in the learning design space. So that's when I started following you all. And I'm glad that our paths crossed the way that they did.
Yeah, same. And just to touch on one thing, for those of you who might not be familiar, NVDA is just a type of screen reader, and it's a common type of
Right.
screen reader for a lot of folks. And there are others like JAWS. Some people will use VoiceOver that is native on their, maybe if they're a Mac user, some people might use Narrator on Windows. So it depends on folks' preferences, right?
That's right. I use NVDA personally because it is free, it's open source, and it's widely used. Narrator and VoiceOver are also free and they're native to their respective operating systems. And then JAWS is one of the oldest screen readers, but it is still a for-profit product. It's a little bit more of a monthly cost than I'm interested in paying right now.
Yeah, that was my first experience with a screen reader was I was working at CarMax as a training
Mhm.
supervisor, and during onboarding we had folks who were either had partial vision disabilities, so they might have a need to magnify the screen and use a screen magnifier,
Mhm.
or we had folks that were completely blind. And I got to experience a lot of that really early in my career. But to your point, it was so expensive that at the time I couldn't get a license for it to
Yeah.
test things in my job. So I really had to rely on those folks to help us from a training perspective, which is an undue burden on folks, right? It's really positive that now there are other tools available so that we can test things now a little bit
For
and
sure.
try things out. And I know you're going to be doing a session right after this with the Learning Guild to talk about
Yeah,
screen
back to
readers.
back.
Yeah, on a roll today. Jacob, as Kareen mentioned earlier, has been joining these exclusives since the beginning. And
Yeah.
I would say I actually, Jacob, didn't know that you were a screen reader user. I did not know that you
Hmm.
were blind until months after I met you. And the
Yeah.
first time that I even knew was I was on, I think it was on LinkedIn, and I read one of your Substack posts.
Hmm.
And I immediately got pulled into it and went down a whole rabbit hole. Actually, in the middle of the night, I was just reading Jacob's Substack because it was such good information to really help me better understand how you are experiencing different things in our field and in the world. And I know
Yeah.
that you are working through a degree program right now.
Hmm.
There were some really interesting things about taking assessments. I was
Yeah.
things that I had thought about, but not through the perspective that you gave. And that was actually a big reason why I took the approach that I did on the book, Designed for All Learners. And I know
Hmm.
that's not what we're here to talk about today, but it is something that I think is really important is to learn from folks' firsthand perspectives. So it's
Yeah.
like I can play around with a screen reader or I can play around with a color simulator to see what it might be like to be colorblind. And I can do some of those things, but it really helps to hear firsthand accounts because you're living that. And so you get to experience things firsthand that I might not even think about. And so It was really
Right?
important to me because we claim that XCL is the most accessible tool on the market to deliver and track learning experiences. And I felt very confident in making that claim because we
Mhm.
go through a rigorous process in building these things. The people that I brought on for the development team, both Rob, Bryn Kennedy, who did our UX design, everyone on our team is well versed in accessibility standards, so the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. We have an organization that we work with, OLEB Media. They have an incredible reputation for testing in software and also in the learning field and use natural user testers. So I felt like I had
Mhm.
enough information to credibly say, yes, this is the most accessible tool on the market. But I thought, does it actually meet the test of somebody using it for real? Because it's one thing to
Right?
have everybody testing it and checking web content accessibility guidelines. It's very different to use something in practice to achieve a goal. So, what we're here for today is to have Jacob tell us a little bit about what's your experience actually using this tool to do your job, to actually do
Yeah,
this function. You can kick us off, Jacob, wherever you want. Tell us maybe where you got started
sure.
with using XCL and what that experience was like.
Absolutely. And I promised not to spill the beans ahead of time for everybody listening. This is the first time the team is hearing this from me too. And to your credit, XCL is, I think, the most accessible learning tool that I've used. There have been only a small number of issues that I've had trying to use the platform. And when I reached out to your tech team to raise a point about accordion menus that weren't working properly, I received a message same day saying, "Oh, we're already aware of that. There's a fix in that's ready to be deployed." So like you've already been on top of it. And I love that because it feels when I use XCL like the tool just gets out of my way and lets me do my job, which is what we really ideally want from any tool. The only other issue I think I've had from getting enrolled and all the way up to deploying my first test course was when you like working through a workflow that has several different pages, like you're publishing a new link. When I click the next button to go to the next page in the workflow, the screen reader focus does not reset itself to the top of the screen or to the top of the window. So it, like I have to manually shift my focus back up to the top. That's literally the only like minor thing, and once you get the hang of it, like it just becomes another thing that you do as part of your workflow to get back to where you're going. It's just like a focus order issue. And literally, if that's the one and only kind of nitpick that I have, I can't think of a better tool to use if you are a screen reader user than XCL. With the caveat that the authoring tools that I need to use to build content for XCL are not necessarily always accessible. What I love is that XCL also can let me import things like PDFs or web links or several other different types of content that don't necessarily have to be a fully published course because I'm still working out the issues on finding an authoring tool that's as accessible as XCL. So you're ahead of the rest of the industry, I think, is the conclusion that I've drawn there.
So thanks for sharing that, Jacob. First of all, Rob is on the call and taking notes. So I'm sure Rob's okay. Focus order. I got to get that in. But the thing that I find really interesting about talking about this topic is that it's always going to be something upstream or downstream that affects
Hmm.
accessibility in my experience because you can have somebody who is really good at building accessible content and you can have somebody who's really good at making sure that the communications are accessible, but it's like there's always something in the process where someone's not in the loop,
Yeah.
then all the hard work that everybody does completely breaks down because the
Yeah.
accessibility gets broken somewhere along that chain. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the authoring tools side of things and maybe some of the things that you've tried and then what you're working on now. So maybe could you tell us a
Sure.
little bit about what you mean by the authoring tools that you were trying weren't particularly accessible? Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. Some of the industry standards, like Articulate and Captivate, simply are not screen reader accessible. I've reached out to some of their different support teams, and I keep getting the same messages. We are dedicated to creating accessible learning courses for all of our users, and they're great at building content that learners can learn from. But when it comes time to being able to actually be a designer who is blind, they fall down flat. And this isn't just Articulate, it's Captivate, it's so many other like iSpring. All of them have their own accessibility issues where a screen reader user just can't seem to access them. There are a couple of tools that I'm passively familiar with, Domino, but then the cost for those is prohibitive to an individual. So if I'm not part of an organization that has a Domino subscription, it's out of reach. So what I've been doing is using AI vibe coding tools like Replit and Lovable to build my own learning courses and programs. And I'm currently in the process of building out a learning game for non-screen reader users to practice using a screen reader
Mm.
to test WCAG. Basically, you'd use a screen reader to say, find the heading that's out of order and select what the issue is and what the fix might be. And the game updates in real time to show you what the fix would look like. I've got a really cool proof of concept working, but then it becomes an issue of like, how do I get that proof of concept from this AI vibe coding tool into XCL? So that's the last remaining piece that I'm still trying to work out myself, and maybe I'll have some insight on that today. But the fact that I'm turning to these tools to build a course, it's there because the other tools in the industry that are part of everybody's workflow just don't seem to be within reach for me personally. So, like I've done for most of my life, I've gone my own way and just forged a new path ahead because that's what you have to do sometimes.
So there's so much innovation that comes out of the accessibility space because folks have
Yeah,
had to work around barriers for so long. And
yeah.
I think one of the things that, as you were talking, it reminds me of, so when I was working on the book, there was a really good story from Leah Holroyd who talked about this and talked about how there's this underlying assumption that somebody who is blind wouldn't be doing an instructional design job. And the reality is that they're not doing that job because of the barriers that are in place to prevent you from being able to do that job. If the tools are not accessible to you, then no, you can't do it because now you've been prevented from being able to do a job that you want to do. And I think that is a really important point to this call because that I learned while working on the book was I know Rob and Kareen and everyone on the team knows how hard I push this to our team to
Yeah.
say I never want anyone to pick up this tool and feel they were excluded from being part of the design. And I think it's easier to do that when you think about it ahead of time and you're
Hmm.
planning for that and building that way. But to your point, how frustrating is it that every major industry tool that is not cheap, by the way,
Yeah.
is very expensive, can only be used by a very specific set of people? And that it's really important for us today to clarify on this call that when an organization talks about accessibility in the learning space, they're often talking about making the output accessible. So the
Right.
learning content. And it was really important for us in XCL to say, hey, if you make really accessible learning content, we're going to make sure that the process that you use to deliver and track it is as accessible as possible, not just to your learners, but for you too, as an administrator, that the tool is accessible to use. But I think a lot of companies will tout that they are very accessible. But what they're saying
Mhm.
is that whatever the output is accessible, and that's only to a certain degree. But that doesn't mean
Right.
their tool is accessible. It doesn't mean that it's accessible to use. And I think that clarification is one that's very important. And I noticed that you recently wrote an article about this. Who are we unintentionally excluding by making assumptions and assuming that
Right.
people wouldn't be using this? Or, of course, you wouldn't be designing or editing audio files if you can't hear. But
Right.
there's a lot of audio editing that I've done without listening to it, like adding silence and normalizing the audio and all these things that you can do where you don't have to hear it. So there are all these things that if you are doing this from your own perspective, if you've had to work around the barriers of the tools, if someone had just included you in that design process and thought about that persona and that end user that would be actually using this tool, then you start to factor in how might they use this differently and how might they still be able to do this work if I were to remove some barriers from being able to do it. And sometimes it's just making it accessible to assistive technology. the bigger part is also the process, which is what you mentioned about using XCL. Yes, it's accessible to a screen reader, but in a workflow, it would be helpful for the focus order to reset after the next button back to the top. That's a
Right.
thing that you wouldn't necessarily get out of testing unless you were testing it through a workflow.
Yeah, exactly. And even if you were testing it, if you're not testing it with native users, it might be something that you don't even notice
Mm.
because a lot of people who are just picking up a screen reader to kind of test through something, they'll say, oh, that was something that I could complete without a lot of friction, therefore it must pass. It's not until you encounter this day after day and you've gotten attuned to what to look for that you start to notice these little usability issues. Maybe they don't fail WCAG, but changing them would certainly help the workflow and make it that much easier for people. So there's a point where accessibility, we talk about this a lot in the accessibility community, that it's not a checklist, and it really isn't because you can go through the list of items to figure out what is or is not accessible, but until you actually test it with native users of assistive technology, you won't know for sure how usable it is for them.
Yeah, and I think we can all relate to that from a usability perspective across the board because if for
Yeah.
those who are listening or watching this and tuning into this episode today, one of the things that you may have experienced is using a tool that functionally will get the job done, but is a nightmare to use, right? So
Mhm.
that's the difference between accessibility and usability. Can it work? Will it do it? Yes, with a whole bunch of workarounds and a lot of frustration, a lot of extra time.
Right.
So that's the difference between testing something out and does it do it? Sure. Is it hard to do it? And is it a waste of time? And I think a lot of tools and platforms don't test with any users, much less anyone that's
Yeah.
a natural user of assistive technology. So I think it's really important for folks who are building tools, building technology, even building e-learning to actually get that feedback loop of testing things out. Let us know if you ran into any barriers across the board. Did
Right.
you run into any issues? What made this difficult? And getting that feedback and working that into your process going forward. Rob, I wanted to throw Jacob's question over to you. So Jacob mentioned, I'm going to try to go off on my own and just build this myself, right? Because the authoring tools are just not
Yeah.
cutting it. How might we how might we have folks, because Jacob, you're not the first person that I've seen try to do this. I know Josh
Hmm.
Cavalier's been trying to do it, Jeff Batt's been trying to do it. They're all trying to vibe code these XAPI solutions. How could they get that packaged in such a way where they could load it to XCL without it being an authoring tool like Articulate that's packaging it up for them for XAPI?
Yeah, so you're looking at like the packaging for tin can. That's the
Hmm.
key to the interoperability with XCL. So essentially, as long as it's packaged for tin can, it's going to have the right metadata files. XCL is going to identify what it is and set it up correctly. And when it opens, we're going to pass it the information that you don't have. So we're going to pass through the player, we're going to give it the endpoint, the user, some credentials, a registration number, all the things that will give the data more meaning on the reporting side. And essentially, outside of that, you're just using XAPI. It's that simple, as the standard states kind of thing, but you don't need to hard code any of those variable pieces.
Parameters.
So you end up with a
Oh, okay.
package that's much more useful after the fact because it can be
Yeah.
used in XCL. And we always say it doesn't have to be XCL. It will always be XCL because it's so much more useful. It could be useful in other places, could be resellable in other places.
Hey, Rob, I think you need
Okay.
to talk
Yeah.
to us about what you mean by tin can.
Ah, ho, ho, ho.
For the non-XAPI history
So
people.
for the non-XAPI history people, so XAPI as a standard really doesn't cover packaging that strongly. However, the Tin Can is a project that did cover some packaging, so it's a little less formal, but it is what all the rapid authoring tools already use as a packaging standard to create XAPI conformant packages. And it's what most, I would say, LXPs or LMS that use Tin Can would use to launch those style of courses because the alternative is very bleak, is hard coding everything and or finding other ways to get that sort of data from an LXP to the course. So it's de facto, it works, it's the going standard, and there's a lot of open source around how to get that integrated into a piece of training. So that's a good use case.
And so, for those of you following along on the home game, Project Tin Can was the code name for XAPI. And there was a lot of talk after it switched to XAPI, like why did we switch it from Tin Can to XAPI? When they got away from the code name and ADL said we're going to call it the Experience API. And the folks at Rustasy were part of this original project in that original setup of XAPI, along with other folks. They weren't the only ones, but they really pushed on marketing of Tin Can. And so sometimes for those of you who might see where it says Tin Can in your authoring tool, that's why you're still seeing that because of the packaging. Rob?
Yes, yes. So because the packaging components didn't really make it to the standard in the same way, we can still say use tin can packaging. And it uses that kind of original thought and idea around how to package content for XAPI distribution from the tin can project, but was never really formally added to the standard because the standard kind of it stops at the interoperability of the code and how you
This,
move messages.
we're doing such a good job
I
of
love
being
it.
diplomatic.
I'm working
Um,
very hard.
So I think it would be really interesting as a follow-up to this, Jacob, if we helped you set that up and then we just document the
Yeah.
process. And then we could have a coming soon release for all of you folks who are trying to figure out how to do this. Maybe we could show you how to set up and code some of your own stuff and then package that up for XCL. So that'd be really
Yeah,
cool.
that would be great.
So before I wrap us up for today, we have about 6 minutes left, and Jacob has to jump over to this other webinar
Oh,
that he'll be doing today. But I did want to make an announcement. We have been going through the VPAT process for XCL, which is part of the reason why every time, so when Jacob would mention something, he'd be like, hold on, what about this? It seems like it's not working. I'm like, yeah, it's already in our list. We're already working on it for the release. That's because we were going through that VPAT at the same time. And for those of you who aren't familiar with that terminology, it's a voluntary product accessibility template. And vendors will fill that out to say to what extent they meet the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines or the WCAG. And we've been going through that process. We work with an external company that goes through that for us because you can self fill that out, but I need to have somebody else go through that process, especially natural user testers that can make sure that we don't
mhm.
miss anything. But we got word yesterday that process is finished and we have passed all of the WCAG.
Wow.
Yeah, double A standard and with flying colors, if you will. And so that will be available for download on our website this week. And we make that publicly available. Some vendors will make you email them and call them and whatever. It's just going to be
Trying to
available
hide
as a
something.
download. I know this is information you should just provide to people publicly. And I don't know why people don't, but if you're going through the process of trying to get a new tool for your organization, whether it's instead of an LMS or to extend the capabilities of your LMS, and you go through that procurement process, a lot of organizations will ask you for a VPAT from that
Hmm.
vendor, an accessibility conformance report. Sometimes that's the same exact thing, and that will be available on our website for download this week. So if you need that for your company or just for your
That's super
own
exciting.
research to see if it's something that will meet your needs, you'll have that accessible to you. So, Jacob, I just wanted to wrap us up today with, are there any other suggestions or things that you want to share with the XCL or Build Capable community or the learning community in general about your experience in using XCL or anything you would recommend to folks going forward?
Yeah, I think the last thing that I want to say that I haven't yet is learning designers and instructional designers. We spend so much time trying to create courses that are accessible because I don't think there's a single instructional designer who wants to make a course that people cannot access. Everybody has a really good heart, but sometimes the tools are in our way, or sometimes we work really hard to make a good accessible course, but then the LMS gets in the way. And to your point earlier, there's always some step in the workflow that you don't have total control over. What I love about XCL is that you can ditch the LMS and not make that part of the equation anymore. So if you've built this really great, beautiful, accessible course and you put it into XCL, you're getting everything you need out of it with all of the XAPI statements and the reporting and the analysis, but you don't have to worry about your LMS being inaccessible and restricting users from being able to access the great course that you spent all this time on. So I really think that this type of, I don't know if you necessarily think of XCL as a headless kind of environment, but
Yes.
yeah, that's definitely how I think of it. And I think that's the way to go in the future because it really, I think being minimal in your approach can help increase the accessibility of things.
I think that's an excellent point. And so Jacob said headless. It's always funny. I always tell Kareen that it makes me think of the headless horseman every time somebody talks about headless LMSs. But that is the jargon in our industry, right? For what we've built with XCL is that you can go headless, which means you don't have to go log into a platform. You don't have those extra layers of interface or a platform that you have to go to. You can actually access that content wherever you already are. And that was
Oh,
extremely important to us and fundamental to why we built XCL because of the customers that asked for it over and over again. And we were trying to get things into an LMS only to get them back out again and pretend like they weren't in the LMS. And it was a lot of work and a lot of money for not a lot of value. And that was a big goal. So I appreciate you bringing that up and also giving me the Headless Horseman mental picture. We are coming up on Halloween not too long.
that's true.
We
Halloween
need
stuff
to
was
do
already
a
out.
we need to do a marketing campaign about headless LMSs with the headless
Oh my gosh.
horseman for
During
Halloween, Sarah.
October. Oh my
That's
goodness.
great.
I'm gonna manifest this into an actual like
Kareen
messaging.
loves Halloween.
I do love
Oh,
Halloween.
nice.
Um,
I know. It is the end of time. I did want to let you all know that our next guest next month will be Jeff Batt, and he's going to do a little expose on data. A lot of folks talk
Mm.
about different data standards, SCORM 1.2, SCORM 2004, XAPI. And we are going to come to you next month, at the end of next month, with the goal to help you better understand what those different publishing standards will get you. So if you click the 1.2 button, publish it, here's the data you should expect. If you click SCORM 2004, here's the data you should expect, XAPI and so forth. So Jeff will be on. He's doing some research in some different LMSs, and we're going to go undercover and explain to you how some of these things work in different tools, and then how this works in XCL and what you should expect from a data perspective. So thank you so much, Jacob, for joining us. I
Thank
am
you.
so grateful to you for taking the time to share with us today, and enjoy your next presentation.
Thank you, everybody.